I used to work on an isolated farm deep in the countryside, taking care of a vast cornfield. It was exhausting work but peaceful, and I enjoyed the quiet nights. Even though the place had a reputation for being strange among the locals, I always ignored the stories. That night, I stayed late to finish sorting some corn cobs that were scheduled for delivery the next day. It was already past 10 when I wrapped up and began walking back to the shed. The darkness in the field was oppressive, but I had my flashlight and knew the path well. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the corn leaves, but the sounds were different. They were whispers, low, almost imperceptible, but repetitive. I couldn't make out the words, if they were even words. My initial reaction was to ignore them, but the whispers seemed to move, surrounding me. Something inside me told me to leave, but curiosity won. I followed the sounds with my flashlight, illuminating the narrow path between the rows of corn. The stalks were so tall that they blocked any view around me, but the whispers, they grew louder. I started to smell something strange in the air, something metallic and sweet, like blood mixed with earth. After a few minutes, I reached the center of the field. I rarely ventured there since there was nothing of interest. But that night, something was different. In the middle of the field stood a scarecrow. Shouldn't have been there. I knew every inch of that farm, and I had never seen anything like it. At first, I thought someone had played a prank, but as I got closer, my stomach churned. The scarecrow's face looked human, not in a caricatured way. It was made of skin. The texture, the wrinkles, even the pores were there. The eyes were empty holes, yet it felt like they were watching me. The mouth was sewn shut with what appeared to be rusty wire. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The silence was so intense that even my breathing felt too loud. I turned, ready to run back to the shed, but my flashlight flickered for a second. When the light came back, the scarecrow was no longer there. I felt the ground tremble faintly, as if something was moving beneath the soil. I ran as fast as I could, tripping and nearly falling several times. When I finally reached the dirt road leading to the shed, I turned back. The scarecrow was there, standing in the middle of the path, watching me. It was much closer now, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its arms were no longer hanging. They were outstretched toward me, as if beckoning. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I returned with the farm owner and some other workers, but we found nothing. No scarecrow, no signs that anyone had been there. I quit that job later that week and never went back. To this day, I can't pass by a cornfield without feeling like something is watching me. If you ever hear whispers in an empty field, leave. Don't look back. And for the love of God, never, ever trust a scarecrow. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys big parties, so when my neighbors across the street, a friendly middle-aged couple, invited me to spend New Year's Eve at their farm, I thought it sounded perfect. They talked about the peace and quiet, homemade food, and the starry sky far from the city noise. It was irresistible. We arrived shortly before 9 in the evening. The house was simple but cozy, and the cornfield surrounding it looked like a golden sea under the light of the full moon. They prepared a wonderful feast: roasted meat, wine, and delicious desserts. The couple was incredibly kind, sharing stories about the farm and laughing at my bad jokes. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. Shortly after midnight, once the fireworks had stopped, my hosts began acting strange. The husband became quiet, almost distracted, while the wife, who had been quite talkative earlier, avoided looking me in the eye. I felt uneasy, but I assumed they were just tired. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint and distant, coming from the cornfield, like someone walking through it. I looked out the window, and under the pale moonlight, I saw two hooded figures disappearing between the rows. "Is there someone in your field?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The husband just shook his head and muttered, "Don't worry, it's nothing," but it was something. I knew it. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight by the door and stepped out into the field. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was broken only by the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I walked a few yards, lighting the path ahead, but I quickly realized I wasn't alone. I saw fresh footprints on the ground and, a little further ahead, a faint red glow. I approached cautiously and found a small, makeshift altar made of stones and branches. On it were lit candles and blood. My stomach churned. It was fresh blood, dripping from what looked like a piece of flesh or a human organ. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. "You shouldn't be here." It was the husband's voice, but when I turned, he no longer looked like the kind man who had invited me to dinner. He was holding a knife, and his eyes were cold, empty, like someone who had lost all trace of humanity. I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did, trying to get away from him and the hooded figures now appearing among the rows of corn. The problem was the field felt endless. Every time I thought I was close to the exit, I found myself facing more rows of corn, as if the place was changing around me. I managed to hide for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the wife scream, "We can't let him escape. The sacrifice must be completed." My heart raced. They weren't joking. I was the sacrifice. I'm still running as I record this, trying to find a way out. My phone battery is almost dead, but I had to leave this account behind somehow. If anyone finds this, please don't trust anyone who seems too kind. And if someone invites you to a New Year's Eve party at an isolated farm, say no, no matter how tempting it sounds. I just wanted a peaceful New Year's Eve. Now I just want to survive. I spent last summer at my grandparents' farm. It was an old place, surrounded by miles of cornfields that seemed endless. Although I enjoyed the fresh air and the silence, there was always something slightly unsettling about the place, especially at night. My grandparents had one strict rule: never go outside after dark. At first, I thought it was just elderly paranoia, but they spoke about it with such seriousness that I started to feel uneasy. "You don't understand," my grandfather would say, his eyes fixed on the window. "What's out there isn't meant for you." On the third night, something strange happened. I was already in bed, almost asleep, when I heard laughter outside. It wasn't distant or muffled. It sounded close. I quickly got up and went to the window. There they were, children running through the rows of corn. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but they seemed to be playing tag, jumping and laughing as if it were a playground. It was odd because my grandparents didn't have any nearby neighbors, and no children lived around. I stood there, watching, mesmerized, until I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. Despite the laughter and running, their footsteps made no sound. It was as if they were floating, yet they still crushed the corn leaves beneath their feet. Heart pounding, I ran to my grandfather's room. He woke up startled, and when I told him what I'd seen, the color drained from his face. "You saw children?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded. "Those children disappeared over 20 years ago." He hesitated, glancing at the window as if expecting to see something. "And they're still looking for company." Before I could say anything, he grabbed the old rifle that leaned against the wall and turned off every light in the house. My grandmother appeared in the living room, pale and silent, clutching a rosary. I wanted to believe he was overreacting, that it was some local superstition, but the laughter outside grew louder, closer. My grandmother began praying softly, while my grandfather pulled me into the farthest corner of the house. He seemed to hear something beyond the laughter, something I hadn't noticed yet. If you hear someone knock at the door, don't open it. No matter what they say, the laughter suddenly stopped. It was replaced by something far worse. A slow, rhythmic knocking at the front door. "Please, let us in." It was a child's voice, sweet and melodic, but there was something wrong about it. Something I couldn't quite explain. My grandfather aimed the rifle at the door but didn't move. I could see sweat dripping down his forehead. "We're not alone," my grandmother whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, I heard heavy footsteps on the roof, and at that moment the knocking on the door ceased. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The next morning, when we finally stepped outside, the cornfields surrounding the house were crushed, as if someone or something had walked in circles for hours. I never saw those children again, but I still hear their laughter on the quietest nights, like a distant echo. And I always wonder what would have happened if someone had opened the door.